This is Cultural Studies, a Critical Lens with Mrs. Anderson. What is cultural studies? When we look at literature through a cultural studies lens, we focus on social class, nationality, ethnicity, race, lifestyle, such as whether or not they live in a country, on a boat, in a city, gender stereotypes, politics, historical foundations, conflicts, and the defining traits of a specific generation. And what I mean by the defining traits of a specific generation, if I were to put your generation in a defining trait, I would say the defining trait is a cell phone, because I don't think you can live without it anymore. Some questions that we ask and answer during this time are: who is the cultural other? Is there anyone who is silenced? Is language used as a form of oppression? Is there a cultural clash represented? And how are the characters affected by their current level of knowledge, skills, and education? Our author today is Langston Hughes, a Harlem Renaissance poet.
Langston Hughes is considered a great author because he spoke to, for, and about black people in America.
Poet, novelist, and playwright, Langston Hughes was the leading voice of the Harlem Renaissance.
America was changing during the time that Langston Hughes was so popular. Black consciousness was becoming more and more public, more prominent. I think that Langston Hughes was important because he was one of the early figures to show the dignity and the beauty of ordinary black life.
He was one of the most visible of the younger black poets, a new generation that described themselves as the new Negro. They covered new topics, took on new poetic forms, and sought a wider audience, and Langston Hughes was at the forefront of that.
James Mercer Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri on February 1st, 1902.
He wrote a lot about being lonely when he was young, and I think that was a tremendous part of the product of moving around so much.
After graduating high school, Hughes published his first and most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers.
It is the first poem that celebrates Africa and dignifies the image of Africa in American literature.
The Negro Speaks of Rivers was published in a popular black journal, and so he was really rather widely read from the beginning. His poetry and his prose actually had access to everyday people.
While studying at Columbia University, Hughes discovered the Harlem art scene, spending hours in jazz and blues clubs, weaving the rhythms of music into his work.
Jazz and blues were great influences on Langston Hughes. He sought to capture the energy and vitality of the music in his poetry.
He was very familiar with the Harlem nightlife. He knew the musicians, and later in his life he would even collaborate with some of the key figures at that time, such as Duke Ellington.
Hughes was a prolific writer and one of the first African-American authors who could support himself through his writing.
Langston Hughes wrote plays. He edited anthologies of poets of African descent across the diaspora. He wrote short stories. One of his most famous series of short stories centers around Jessie B. Simple. These are tales told by a resident of Harlem to an aspiring writer who's a stand-in for Langston Hughes.
He was one of the more widely published of the young poets of the period. He was also among the better connected. He really worked hard to promote the careers of other young writers in Harlem and also throughout the rest of his life. That's also one of his big legacies.
Langston Hughes died of cancer on May 22, 1967. His Harlem residence was given landmark status, a fitting tribute for a legendary writer.
His influence, his ambition as a creative writer, his success, his accessibility. He wrote for the average person. He was not writing for college classrooms. He was not writing for the elite. All of those things, I think, require that we recognize and acknowledge him as a great American literary voice of the 20th century.
The culture, Harlem Renaissance. Let's take a closer look at the culture of 1920s Harlem, the era in which this poem was written.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, Black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of Black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of Black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith rose to prominence.
Began to cry. He went away and never even said goodbye.
The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
The Harlem Renaissance is a facet of a larger movement that we think of as the New Negro movement, where you have a new generation of Black people, by this point 2 generations out of slavery, using the arts as a way to help people gain broader civil and political rights.
Some of the framers of what became the Renaissance make the argument that the artistic worth of a people has to be proven by the worth of the art and literature they produced, and especially for people that historically, over centuries, have been defined as without culture, without history, and without any record of achievement.
The Harlem Renaissance was the flowering of creativity that had been suppressed for centuries. People that had the sense that things were opening up, and finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
Mother to Son by Langston Hughes, written in 1922. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I's been a-climbing on, and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you set down on the steps, 'cause you finds it kinda hard. Don't you fall now, for I's a still going, honey. I's a still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. A cultural analysis. Let's take a closer look. According to the mother's story about her life, who can we infer is the cultural other? Remember, the cultural other is anyone outside of their dominant culture. Culture includes things like social class, music, food, and cultural capital, the level of knowledge, skills a person has, the language they speak, the clothes they wear. All of those things are included in culture. How is the mother affected by her level of education, skills, and current knowledge? And is there a cultural clash represented? We have to look not just at the mother's culture, but the culture of the day. Remember, this is 1920s Harlem, during the Harlem Renaissance. We still had a fair amount of racism in America. So the cultural clash represented may not be explicitly stated. You might have to think about what 1920s America was like for an African American woman who did not have a lot of money. Those are the things we'll look at for cultural analysis.